The Sinclair Estate passed to a distant cousin on the 14th of October, 1848, and on the 17th, Maren Sinclair arrived with 2 trunks and no illusions. She stood in the entrance hall of Ashford Park with her hands at her sides and her chin level, taking inventory the way she always took inventory, beginning at the ceiling and working downward. The plaster work was cracked along the north cornice. The chandelier had lost 3 drops of crystal and no one had swept them from the tile below. The turkey rug near the door had been turned once to hide the wear pattern but had been turned incorrectly, so the wear was simply on the other edge now. The footman who had opened the door was 18, perhaps 19, and wore his livery as though it had been intended for a larger man. He had not asked her name. He had simply looked at her and then looked past her, at her 2 trunks, and made some private calculation about what she was. She told him her name anyway. Miss Maren Sinclair. I wrote to advise of my arrival. I believe there was correspondence with the new Duke. The footman's expression shifted in the way expressions shifted when the wrong answer was required. His Grace is not receiving today. Maren looked at the chandelier's missing drops on the tile floor. Then she looked at the footman with the particular steadiness of someone who has dealt with closed doors long enough to know which ones would eventually open. "Then I will wait," she said. She set her bag on the low bench near the window without being invited and removed her gloves, 1 finger at a time. "I have been waiting for rather a long time already. A few more hours will not distinguish themselves." The entrance hall of Ashford Park smelled of damp stone and beeswax, and something beneath both of those, something older, like papers stored in a room that was never opened. Maren knew that smell. It was the smell of an estate with problems it had not yet admitted to. She pressed one hand briefly against the wall beside the bench. The plaster was cool and slightly soft. The damp was not superficial. In the drawing room across the hall, through doors left carelessly ajar, she could hear the sounds of a household that had been recently disrupted and had not yet resettled. A woman's voice, precise and carrying. The lower register of a solicitor or secretary explaining something about inventories. A longer silence that followed an answer no one had wanted to give. Maren sat down, crossed her ankles, and waited. She was 28 years old. She had been managing this estate's eastern properties, the tenant farms, the wool contracts, the drainage repair schedule, the correspondence with the Sheffield merchant who owed them 6 months of adjusted payment, for 4 years. She had done so as the unmarried niece of the late Edmund Sinclair, who had kept her employed without title or salary, on the understanding that family owed family a certain loyalty. She had managed the eastern properties, and then the central accounts, and then the correspondence with the solicitors when Edmund's health made him unable to hold a pen, and then the household itself for the final 18 months of his life. She had managed all of it. Her name appeared on none of it. The Sinclair Estate was entailed through the male line, and there was, it turned out, a male line, a distant one, Scottish and remote and entirely theoretical until 3 weeks ago, when a solicitor's letter had made it actual. His name was William Radcliffe, Duke of Strathmore. He was a Sinclair on his mother's side, twice removed. He had inherited the estate, the house, the tenant farms, the wool contracts, and the drainage schedule. He had also, though he could not have known it, inherited Maren's 4 years of undocumented labor and the records of it, which she had copied in her own hand and stored in the second trunk. She was not going to leave without an accounting. That was not stubbornness, it was mathematics. To understand why Maren Sinclair was sitting in the entrance hall of Ashford Park with her ankles crossed and her chin level on a wet October afternoon in 1848, it was necessary to understand what she had been before the letter came, and before Edmund Sinclair died, and before the estate changed hands to a stranger she had never met. Her father, James Sinclair, had been Edmund's younger brother. He had also been, in most of the practical ways that mattered, the one who ran things, the one who sat with the tenants when rent was short, the one who met the wool merchant in Sheffield because Edmund found commerce distasteful, the one who revised the estate accounts each quarter and found the discrepancies that Edmund preferred not to look at directly. James Sinclair had died in March of 1841, when Maren was 24, leaving behind a small annuity he had never managed to grow, a collection of annotated agricultural pamphlets, and a daughter who had been working beside him since she was 16. The annuity reverted on James's death. There was a provision Edmund had not mentioned, in language no one had thought to show Maren until after the solicitor was gone. She had read it twice, standing at the writing table in the study, while the March light came in gray through the window, and then she had folded it and set it down, and stood very still for a long moment. She did not cry. She straightened her spine and continued. Edmund had offered the arrangement almost before she asked. She could stay. She would be family. There would naturally be some acknowledgement of her contribution when the time came. There was not, in the offer, a salary. There was not, in the offer, a contract. She understood what she was accepting, and she accepted it anyway, because the alternative was a governess position in Derbyshire for £40 per annum and a room above the nursery, and she had decided, standing at that writing table with the light coming in gray, that she was not going to become less than she was. The 4 years that followed were the fullest work of her life. The Eastern tenant farms had been operating under leases that had not been renegotiated since 1829, which meant they reflected neither the improvements made to the land nor the increased value of the wool clip. Maren renegotiated 9 of the 11 leases in her first year, quietly, in meetings Edmund did not attend, which suited everyone because Edmund believed the tenants were loyal enough to be taken at their word, and the tenants believed she was acting on Edmund's authority. She split the difference and let both beliefs stand. The Sheffield merchant, a man named Carver, round-faced, confident in the way men were confident when they expected to deal with someone less informed than themselves, had been skimming the adjusted payment by approximately £400 annually across a rolling 3-year agreement. Maren found this in her 3rd month. She found it in the gap between the weights recorded at the mill and the weights recorded on the estate's own books, which no one had compared side by side in at least a decade. She did not confront Carver dramatically. She wrote him a letter that listed the discrepancy in specific figures, offered him the choice of adjusting the outstanding balance against the following year's contract, or having the matter referred to a solicitor. He adjusted the balance within the fortnight. Edmund never knew. She had not told him because it would have required explaining that no one had checked the ledgers in a decade, and Edmund's pride was one of the things she had been managing as carefully as the accounts. The drainage repair on the North Fields had been deferred twice before she arrived, and would have been deferred a 3rd time on the grounds that the quote from the Sheffield contractor was excessive. She found a local man who had done comparable work on the Hartley estate 6 miles east. She negotiated the work at £60 below the Sheffield quote and supervised 2 of the installation days herself, standing in a field in rubber boots, because the local man's foreman had never built a French drain that emptied correctly onto sloped ground, and she had read enough of her father's pamphlets to know the difference. The North Fields produced a full clip that year for the first time in 4 years. Edmund mentioned that it was an unusually good season. She picked up her list and continued. The last 18 months, Edmund's decline, were the months that had required everything. The creditor in York who held a mortgage note and wanted it called had to be persuaded, by letter, over 6 weeks of correspondence, that the estate's cash position was improving, and that calling the note early would cost both parties. The housekeeper had left in the spring of 1847 and could not be replaced at the existing wage, so Maren had managed the household staff directly, 10 people including the cook and the footman and the 3 women who did the laundry, for 11 months without title or additional acknowledgement. The solicitors, 3 of them in a firm in York, had found it necessary to speak with her when Edmund could no longer conduct business, and had done so with the specific expression of men who were uncertain whether they were dealing with someone they should take seriously. She had given them the quarterly accounts in organized sequence, the creditor correspondence in a separate folder, and a summary of outstanding commitments on a single page. They had taken her seriously after the second meeting. Edmund died in September of 1848. The solicitor's letter regarding the entail arrived 6 days later. She had 1 week between the letter's arrival and her departure from Ashford Park, as its understood, if never formally acknowledged, manager. In that week, she copied the renegotiated lease agreements. She copied the corrected Sheffield merchant accounts with the discrepancy noted in a footnote. She copied the drainage project records with the comparative costs. She copied the creditor correspondence in chronological order. She copied the household accounts for 11 months of her management, with every expenditure and every recovered sum detailed in the margins in her own hand. She organized all of it in a bound leather folder, dated the cover, and put it in the second trunk. She did not know what she intended to do with it. She knew only that 4 years of work had happened, and that it had made a material difference to the estate she was now leaving, and that she was not going to walk away from it as though it had not occurred. The footman came back while she was thinking about the plaster work. "His Grace will see you now," he said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he found this decision surprising. Maren put on her gloves, picked up her bag, and followed him across the hall. William Radcliffe, Duke of Strathmore, had been at Ashford Park for exactly 4 days when the footman told him a Miss Maren Sinclair was waiting in the entrance hall and would not be redirected. He had been at the estate for 4 days, and in those 4 days he had acquired the following understanding. The accounts were in better order than he had expected. The tenant relationships were in better order than he had expected. The drainage situation in the North Fields was, unexpectedly, not a situation at all, and no one on the staff could explain why any of these things were true. The solicitor from York, a man named Alderton, dry and precise in the way of men who have spent 40 years managing other people's consequences, had used the phrase, "considerable recent improvement," 3 times across 2 meetings, without being able to attribute the improvement to any specific person or action. He had referred to the accounts as though they had organized themselves. He had mentioned the Sheffield merchant adjustment in passing, as though it were a matter of course. William had spent 2 evenings reading the estate accounts himself. He was 41 years old, and he had managed the Strathmore holdings in Scotland for 15 years since his father's death. He knew what estate accounts looked like when they were well kept, and what they looked like when they had been recently set in order by someone who understood what they were doing. The Ashford Park accounts had the quality of the latter, consistent, cross-referenced, detailed in the specific places where detail mattered, and brief in the places where brevity was sufficient. Someone had gone through these ledgers with the methodical attention of a person who was not doing it for appearance. There were small corrections in the margins in a hand he had not seen anywhere else in the house. The corrections were not Edmund Sinclair's hand. He had seen Edmund's handwriting on the letters of introduction. It was a woman's hand. He did not know this with certainty. He knew it by inference, the way he knew most things that mattered. Not from the shape of the letters, but from the particular combination of neatness and practicality that suggested someone who had learned to write in a setting where handwriting was a tool rather than a performance. He had asked Alderton whose handwriting appeared in the ledger margins. Alderton had paused for slightly too long. "I believe Miss Sinclair may have assisted with some correspondence toward the end of Mr. Edmund Sinclair's life," he said. William had looked at the margin note on the Sheffield account comparison. It was not the handwriting of someone who had assisted with some correspondence toward the end of a man's life. It was the handwriting of someone who had caught a fraud. He had intended to write to Miss Sinclair. The solicitors had mentioned she would need to vacate the property within a reasonable period, and that a small acknowledgment might be appropriate given the family connection. He had been composing the letter in his mind for 2 days, trying to find language that did not condescend. Then Alderton arrived in the morning with the news that she was already here, already in the entrance hall, and had declined to leave. William stood at the window of the study for a moment. The north fields were visible from this angle. The drainage cuts ran in parallel lines, straight and properly graded. Someone had stood in that field and made those decisions. He turned from the window and told Alderton to show her in. She came through the door the way she must have come through every door in that house for 4 years, without any change in pace, without any performance of arrival. She was tall for a woman of her time, with dark hair dressed plainly, and the kind of posture that does not come from instruction, but from the long habit of refusing to diminish oneself in rooms where diminishment is expected. She wore a gray traveling dress that had been pressed carefully, but was not new. She carried a bag. She looked at him the way she had looked at the footman, directly, taking accurate measure. "Miss Sinclair," William said. "Your Grace," she said, "I apologize for the lack of more formal arrangement." I wrote. "You did." I had not yet responded. He gestured toward the chair across the desk. "Please." She sat. She set the bag on the floor beside her, not in front of her. She placed her hands in her lap. "I have been reading the estate accounts," William said. Something in her expression shifted. Not surprise, not relief, but the particular calibration of someone receiving information they had been waiting for, without knowing when it would arrive. "I imagined you might," she said. "There are a significant number of corrections in the margins of the wool account ledger, spanning approximately 3 years. The hand is consistent throughout and does not match Edmund Sinclair's correspondence." He paused. "Nor does it match the housekeeper's records, which are in a different hand altogether." Maren looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "It is my hand." William had known this. He had known it since the second evening with the ledgers, but hearing her say it plainly, without qualification or apology, produced in him the specific sensation of something that had been slightly out of alignment, falling into its correct position, like a well-built mechanism finally engaged. "I suspected as much," he said. "I would like to understand the full extent of what you managed." She reached down and opened her bag and produced a bound leather folder. She set it on the desk in front of him, and the sound it made against the wood was the sound of a thing that had been carried a long distance and had now arrived where it was going. "Everything is organized chronologically," she said. "The lease renegotiations begin on the 3rd page. The Sheffield account comparison is in the 2nd section, with the original discrepancy calculated in the footnote. The drainage records are in the 3rd section with the comparative costs. The creditor correspondence is in the 4th section. The household accounts are at the back." William looked at the folder. He looked at her. 4 years, he said. 4 years and 3 months, she said. The room was quiet. Outside, the October wind moved through the elms at the edge of the property, and the sound it made was the sound of a large, complicated thing being put gradually into motion. William opened the folder. He read for 11 minutes while she waited. She did not fidget. She did not speak. She looked, with apparent calm interest, at the bookshelves behind his left shoulder, which he suspected she knew the contents of better than he did. He turned to the Sheffield account comparison. He read the footnote. He calculated in his head what £400 annually across 3 years represented, and then he looked at the correction she had managed and the language of the letter she had written, copied here in full, with Carver's responding letter attached. And something in his chest did something quiet and significant that he did not examine immediately. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. "You wrote this letter to Carver yourself," he said. "Edmund was unwell by that time," she said. The phrase covered a great deal. The letter required a specific figure and a specific choice. He would not have been comfortable with either. Carver accepted. Within the fortnight, William turned to the drainage section. He looked at the cost comparison. He looked at the foreman note she had written in the margin. Drain fall angle incorrect. Corrected on site. 14 March 1847. She had stood in that field in March. He closed the folder. He rested his hand on it for a moment. Flat, the way one rested a hand on something one was making a commitment about. "Miss Sinclair," he said, "I should like to make a proposal." She looked at him with the particular stillness of someone who had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. "I am listening," she said. "The estate requires a manager, someone who knows the tenants, the contracts, and the specific problems that do not appear in the official account books because they were resolved before they became official problems." He paused. "I have an estate in Scotland that requires my attention for a significant portion of the year. I cannot run Ashford Park from Strathmore without someone here who understands what they are managing." "You are proposing employment," she said. "I am proposing a formal position with a formal contract and a salary," he said, "at a figure commensurate with the work." He named a figure. It was twice what a competent estate agent would command. It was, he understood, still less than what she was owed. Maren was very still for a moment. She was not calculating the money, he thought. She was calculating something else. What it meant, what it required, what it would cost. "I would want the contract in writing," she said, "with the specific responsibilities listed." "Naturally. And I would want it signed before I agree to remain. I would expect nothing less." She looked at him for another moment with that measuring, unhurried gaze. Then she said, "I should like 24 hours to consider the specific terms before I sign anything." "Of course," he said. She stood, gathered her bag, and moved toward the door. Then she paused, turned, and said, with the particular precision of someone who had noticed something and had been deciding whether to mention it, "Your Grace, your cravat has been improperly tied on the left side. It has been so since you came into the room. I thought you should know." Then she left. William stood alone in the study for a moment. He looked down at his cravat. He straightened it. Then, very quietly, he sat back down behind the desk, opened the leather folder to the first page, and began reading from the beginning. He did not stop until the light failed. The weeks that followed the signing of the contract were, in the organized memory of Ashford Park's household, the weeks when things began to be done differently, not loudly, not with announcement. But Maren moved through the house and the estate with the ease of a person returning to a place she understood, and what she understood began, in specific ways, to show. There was, first, the matter of the household staff, who had spent the 4 days of the new Duke's residence in the particular anxiety of people unsure whether the rules had changed and in which direction. Mrs. Pryor, the temporary housekeeper brought in from York by Alderton's office to manage the transition, was a competent woman who knew how to run a house in the abstract and knew very little about running this one in the specific. Maren sat with her on the second morning of her formal tenure and went through the supply lists, the staff schedule, the coal delivery arrangement, and the twice-yearly linen inventory with the particular thoroughness of someone who had been making these decisions for 11 months and knew which ones mattered. Mrs. Pryor was 45, had been doing household management for 20 years, and recognized within the first hour that she was speaking with someone who was not explaining but remembering. "The cook will want to order from Jensen's in the village rather than the York supplier," Maren said, setting the supply list aside. "It costs the same per unit, but Jensen extends a monthly account, which means the kitchen runs without requiring a weekly draw from the household fund." Edmund preferred the York supplier because his father had used the York supplier. "I would suggest speaking with His Grace about changing the arrangement." Mrs. Pryor wrote it down. She looked at Maren with the frank assessment of someone who had decided in the first 10 minutes of their conversation to trust her. "Will you be speaking with His Grace yourself, then?" she asked. "When necessary," Maren said. She picked up the next list. Now, the linen count. The second matter was the tenant meeting. William had asked her to arrange it, a gathering of the 11 tenant farmers, first to introduce him as the new landowner, and second to hear any outstanding concerns before the winter quarter. He had asked her this because she was the obvious person to ask, and because he had been at Ashford Park for 8 days, and had learned, in those 8 days, that there was almost nothing concerning the estate's actual operations that did not lead back to her. She organized the meeting for a Tuesday, in the barn at the end of the Eastern Drive, which was large enough and was the traditional meeting place, and which the tenants would recognize as a signal that the new management understood the traditions. She sent the notifications herself, in her own hand, because 2 of the 11 tenant farmers were men she had negotiated with directly, and receiving a formal letter from a solicitor's office would have put them on defensive ground before the meeting began. William arrived at the barn to find Maren already there, standing at the far end with the 11 tenants arranged in a rough arc, speaking to them with the ease of someone who had been in this room before. She was not managing the conversation. She was simply occupying it, asking after the Hardcastle family's roof repair, listening to the Moss brothers explain a boundary question that had come up with the Hartley estate next door, acknowledging a point from the eldest Pharaoh with a nod that said she had already made note of it and would not forget. When William entered, every tenant turned to look at him with the careful measuring of men who have learned from experience that new ownership is most often a problem before it is a solution. Maren introduced him without fanfare. "Gentlemen, His Grace the Duke of Strathmore. He has asked me to arrange this meeting because he wanted to hear the estate's concerns directly before the winter quarter, rather than through intermediary correspondence. I expect you will find him worth the cold morning." It was not flattery. It was a statement of expectation that functioned as both introduction and quiet warning to all parties. This meeting should be productive, and she expected it to be. William had conducted a great many meetings with tenants on his Scottish properties. He knew how to listen, how to ask specific questions, how to identify the difference between a complaint that required immediate action and a complaint that required acknowledgement and patience. He did these things here, and afterward 3 of the 11 men approached him individually with small, particular concerns that they had not mentioned in the group. He understood this as a signal of trust, and he understood that the trust was partly in him and partly in the fact that Maren Sinclair had organized the morning in a way that made trust possible. On the walk back to the house, she told him about the Moss brothers' boundary question before he could ask. She had already looked at the survey from 1821 and the revised survey from 1839, and the answer was in the 1839 survey, but the Moss brothers did not know the 1839 survey existed. "I will find the copy in the estate files," she said. "It is in the second drawer of the map cabinet in the North Library. If it is not there, it is at Alderton's office, and I will write for it today." William looked at her. She was walking with her usual focused attention, already half through the next item on some internal list. The morning light was thin and November-edged, and it caught the dark hair at her temples. "How long have you known about the 1839 survey?" he said. "Since the first month I was here," she said. "The Moss brothers have been quietly worried about that boundary for 6 years. I mentioned it to Edmund twice. He said it would sort itself." She paused, and the pause contained a great deal that she did not say. "I am glad of the opportunity to sort it properly." He did not say anything. He held the door of the house open for her, and she walked through it without appearing to notice the gesture. And he noticed that she did not fail to notice it. She simply received it as a thing that required no comment, which was, he thought, different from failing to notice. The formal opposition arrived in the second week of November. which was 4 weeks after Maren had signed her contract, and approximately 3 weeks after the county had become aware that the new Duke of Strathmore had hired a woman as estate manager. The opposition came in 3 forms, which was how it always came. The first was Lady Cecily Moorhead, who arrived at Ashford Park on a Tuesday afternoon with her mother and a very deliberate hat, having formed the understanding before the entail was settled that William Radcliffe was a likely candidate for a particular sort of arrangement. Lady Cecily was 23, accomplished, well-connected, and in full possession of the sort of beauty that is assembled rather than given, the result of considerable effort applied to considerable materials. She moved through the Ashford Park drawing room as though she had already decided she would be moving through it regularly. She looked at Maren, who was crossing the hall with a folder of the Moss Brothers surveying documents, and did not speak to her. She spoke instead to Mrs. Pryor, loudly enough to be heard. "Is that woman staying in the house? I understood the Sinclair connection was being managed." The pause before managed was precisely calculated. Maren set the folder on the hall table and said, without turning around, "Miss Maren Sinclair, His Grace's estate manager. The Moss Boundary Survey, which was your question's actual subject, is in this folder and resolves the matter fully. I would be glad to explain it if it would be useful." Then she picked up the folder and continued to the North Library. She did not hurry. She did not alter her pace. She heard, behind her, a sound that might have been Lady Cecily recalibrating her approach. William, it turned out, had the interview with Lady Cecily and her mother that afternoon, in the drawing room, for 22 minutes. Maren knew the duration because she was working in the adjoining room and was aware, in the way one is aware of the weather shifting, of when the visit ended. She heard the carriage on the drive afterward and did not look up from the survey. The second form of opposition was Lord Gerald Fenwick, who was everything the patriarchal gate always was, a man in his mid-60s with a long relationship to the Strathmore estate holdings through his role as senior investor in a property development scheme William's father had established, and a long relationship to his own certainty that he understood what the proper management of ducal affairs required. He arrived at Ashford Park on a Friday and spent the morning with William in the study, and came out of the study with the expression of a man who had made his position very clear and was now waiting for it to be acted upon. He found Maren in the North Library, where she was organizing the map cabinet. "Miss Sinclair," Fenwick said. He stood in the doorway in the way of a man who is not accustomed to being in rooms without immediately owning them. "I want to speak with you plainly." She looked up from the second drawer. "I have always found plain speaking efficient," she said. "Your position here is an irregularity," he said. "Women have not managed ducal estates. The tenants accept you because they knew you before, and because you have the Duke's apparent authority. But the investors in the Strathmore portfolio, myself included, are not comfortable with the arrangement. It introduces an element of uncertainty. Uncertainty is expensive." He paused. "It would be better for everyone if you were to step back into a more appropriate advisory role, someone confirmable, someone the county would recognize." Maren looked at him with the particular steadiness of someone who has been told a version of this sentence many times and has prepared for it each time. "Lord Fenwick," she said, "in the 4 years I managed this estate without a title, the wool income increased by 22%. The Sheffield account discrepancy, £400 annually, recovered, represents approximately £1,600 over that period. The drainage project prevented a full crop failure in the North Fields, which would have cost the estate considerably more than it cost to build. The creditor negotiation in York last spring prevented the calling of a mortgage note that would have required an emergency liquidation." She opened the second drawer fully and removed the 1839 survey. "None of that happened because I was a confirmable person," she said. "It happened because I know what I am doing. If the investors would like a summary of the estate's recovered margins across my tenure, I will prepare one. If they would prefer certainty to results, they should say so clearly, and I will make certain His Grace is aware of the specific preference. She set the survey on the table and opened it. I have a boundary question to resolve, she said. If there is nothing else, Lord Fenwick. He stood in the doorway for another moment. He was not a small man, and the room was not a large room, and she did not look up from the survey. He left. She sat with the survey for a moment after she heard his footsteps on the corridor. She pressed one hand flat against the table. Then she picked up her pencil and found the line on the 1839 map that the Moss brothers needed, and she measured it, and she wrote the measurement in her notes. She had managed harder things than Lord Gerald Fenwick. The third form of opposition was the least visible and the most pervasive. The whisper of it through county drawing rooms, the remarks at the Alderton firm's offices when her letters arrived, the careful way certain families declined William's dinner invitation in November, citing conflicts that were not quite believable. This opposition had no face and no address. It was simply the way a society adjusted around a thing it considered irregular, applying quiet pressure in the hope that the irregular thing would feel the pressure and remove itself. Maren felt it. She was not made of stone. She felt it the way one feels cold weather, as a fact to be accounted for rather than a catastrophe to be avoided. She brought everything she had, and she put it to work, and she kept doing the work. The thing that surprised her about William Radcliffe was specific. It was not that he listened to her. She had dealt with men who listened to her when it suited them. It was not that he respected her competence. She had earned that grudgingly from Edmund, from Alderton, from Carver the Sheffield merchant, from the tenants. She had learned to receive respect as a tool rather than a gift. What surprised her was that he found her. Not summoned. Found. There was a distinction. She had been working late in the North Library on the third Thursday of November, going through the creditor correspondence to prepare a clean summary for Alderton's January review, when she heard the door open and looked up to find William Radcliffe standing in the frame with a second lamp in his hand. He had noticed, apparently, that she was working by insufficient light. He set the lamp on the table without being asked and without making any remark about it, and he sat down in the chair across from her with his own papers, the Strathmore correspondence that had arrived that week from Scotland, and worked there. They sat in that library for 2 hours with the 2 lamps between them and the fire settling to coals, not speaking except when something required speaking, and the quality of the quiet between them was the quality of 2 people who had independently reached the conclusion that the other person was safe to be quiet near. He looked up at some point and said, "The Hardcastle roof needs replacing before December," she said, without looking up from the creditor letters. "The quote from the York carpenter is excessive. I have written to the same local man who did the drainage. He can manage it for £31 less." "Do it," William said. She wrote it down. On a Friday evening in late November, she found him in the music room. She had not known he played. He had not mentioned it, and she had not thought to ask. The music room at Ashford Park had been closed since Edmund's last illness. One of the rooms that had accumulated that smell of old papers and damp and unmade decisions, and she had walked past it every day for 4 weeks without opening the door. She opened it on a Friday because she could hear music through it, and the music was something she recognized. She stood in the doorway. He was at the piano, his coat removed and draped over the bench beside him, playing with the concentrated inattention of someone who had been playing long enough that their hands knew the work without instruction. The piece was a Scottish air, slow and slightly melancholy, the kind of music that had been written for rooms like this in houses like this by someone who understood what it cost to keep a house, and love it and lose it. He heard the door and looked up. He did not seem embarrassed. He seemed, if anything, slightly more himself than he had in any room she had seen him in so far. "My mother's," he said. The explanation was brief. "She played it. I learned it after." Maren looked at him, at the coat on the bench, at his hands still resting on the keys. "She would have been proud," she said, and she said it simply, not as consolation but as fact, which was the way she said everything that she meant. He was still for a moment. Then he moved the coat from the bench beside him to the top of the piano, and he gestured toward the other end of the keyboard without speaking. She sat down. He played the left hand of the air, and she found the right hand by listening, which she could do because her father had taught her to play in this manner, listening first, then placing. They played it through twice together, inexactly, and the inexactness did not matter. When they stopped, the room was very quiet. "How long since anyone opened this room?" she said. 14 years, he said, "since she died." She looked at the piano keys. She said nothing, because nothing was required, and she had learned long ago the difference between silence that was absence and silence that was presence. He turned, slightly, and looked at her profile. She knew he was looking. She did not look back. She pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the keyboard, a gesture so small it was barely a gesture, and then she stood and said that she had the creditor letters to finish, and she went back to the North Library. She sat at the table for a long while before she picked up the next letter. The lamp he had brought her earlier was still burning. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like recognition, but she noted what had happened, the way one notes a precise measurement, and she kept it. December came in with frost and a clear sky over the north fields, and with it came Lord Fenwick's second action. He had not, as she had suspected, accepted the conversation in the library as a conclusion. He had gone instead to the 3 remaining senior investors in the Strathmore portfolio, men who held interests in a property development scheme adjacent to the Ashford Park holdings, a scheme that required the estate's east boundary to be confirmed as available for expansion. He had told them that the estate's management was unstable, that a woman in the position introduced uncertainty, and that they should, collectively, press the Duke to regularize arrangements before the January meeting. The pressure arrived in a letter to William on the 5th of December, which she knew because William brought it to the North Library and set it on the table in front of her without comment. She read it, 3 names at the bottom, Fenwick's above them, and a paragraph that was remarkably polite in its language and remarkably clear in its implication. The investment confidence of the portfolio depended on conventional estate governance, and if the Duke could not provide assurances, the investors would need to revisit their participation. "They are using the east boundary scheme," she said. "Yes," William said. She looked at the letter for a moment. "The east boundary scheme requires the estate's cooperation to proceed at all. They have no access to that land without it. They know this." "They are assuming I do not know it," he said. "Or that I do not," she said. He looked at her with what she had come to recognize as his particular form of attention, not warm, not cold, but complete. He was not a man who looked at things partially. "You know it," he said. "I surveyed that boundary 2 years ago," she said. "When the scheme's preliminary inquiry arrived, Edmund was ill. I read the inquiry, and I reviewed the boundary rights. The estate has full discretion over whether to grant access. The investors have no independent mechanism. Then their leverage is theoretical," she said. She pulled a blank sheet toward her. "I will prepare a summary of the boundary rights in specific language for the January meeting. If it would help, I will also prepare a summary of what the east boundary access is worth to the scheme, what it would cost them to pursue an alternative route. The comparison will make the negotiation position clear." William looked at her for a long moment. He was standing with his hands at his sides in the particular stillness she had come to associate with him making a decision and holding it. "Miss Sinclair," he said, "the January investors' meeting is in London, at the Strathmore offices. I would like you to attend it." She looked up at him. She understood what he was saying, that he wanted her in that room, not as a secretary or an advisor waiting in an anteroom, but as the person who would stand in front of the investors and make the case with the evidence she had built. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, completely, without hurry, considering what it meant and what it cost. "Yes," she said, "I will prepare the materials." She returned to the blank sheet and began writing. He did not leave the room immediately. He stood at the table for a moment longer, and she was aware of it, and she did not look up. She said it was crooked for 40 minutes, he said after a pause, and she understood he was remembering the cravat. There was something in his voice she did not examine directly. "It was," she said. She did not look up, but she was not, she thought, going to be able to keep not looking up for very much longer. The investors' meeting in London was held on the 14th of January, 1849, in the ground floor conference room of the Strathmore offices in Mayfair, a room designed, as such rooms always were, to make certain people feel that they belonged in it, and other people feel that they did not. The furniture was heavy. The portraits on the walls were old. The light came in from one direction only, and the long table was positioned so that the chair at the head received the light, and all other chairs sat in the relative shadow of it. Lord Fenwick arrived early. He had brought 2 of the 3 signatories and a solicitor of his own, which was a useful indication of how seriously he was taking the morning. Lady Cecily's father, Lord Moorhead, was present as well, which was an indication that Fenwick had been working the social circuit as well as the financial one. There were 11 men in the room when Maren walked in behind William. The room did not erupt. There was a suspended moment, as there always was, in which 11 men made the rapid private assessment of what her presence signified and how they intended to respond to it. Fenwick's expression went carefully neutral. Lord Moorhead looked at William rather than at her, with the expression of a man who is watching for an explanation. William took his chair at the head of the table. He did not explain her. He gestured to the chair at his right hand, and Maren sat down and set the leather folder on the table and opened it. She had prepared 4 documents. The first was a summary of the estate's financial performance across her 4-year management period, with all figures sourced to the specific ledger entries and organized by category: lease income, wool income, household expenditure, creditor obligations, capital improvements. The numbers ran across 4 columns: 1844, 1845, 1846, 1847, and the trajectory was unmistakable. The second was a specific analysis of the east boundary rights, with the relevant legal clauses extracted from the estate's founding deed and the 1839 survey, and a calculation of what alternative access would cost the investor's development scheme if the estate declined to cooperate. The figure was substantial. She had calculated it at 2 different assumptions and listed both, so that no one could accuse her of choosing the number convenient to her argument. The third was a copy of the Carver correspondence, the Sheffield merchant account, showing the original discrepancy, her letter, and his response. She had included it because Fenwick had told William the previous month that the estate's improved financial position was likely attributable to favorable market conditions. She had anticipated this argument specifically. The fourth was a 1-page summary of outstanding improvements planned for the following year: the Hardcastle roof, a second drainage repair on the south field, a renegotiation of the coal supply arrangement, and a proposed revision to the wool contract terms that she estimated would recover an additional £220 annually. Each item had an estimated cost and an estimated return. She presented without argument or apology. She did not raise her voice. She went through each document in sequence, naming specific figures, citing specific dates, answering questions when they arose with the particular calm of someone who has spent 4 years in rooms where she was not supposed to have answers, and has the answers anyway. Fenwick interrupted 3 times. The first time, he questioned the lease renegotiation figures, and she directed him to the specific page and line in the first document. The second time, he questioned her authority to have conducted the Carver negotiation, and she explained, without heat, that she had operated under Edmund Sinclair's general delegated authority, and that the correspondence, reproduced in full in the third document, showed both the problem and the resolution. The third time, he said that historical performance under unusual circumstances was not a reliable indicator of future management capacity. She looked at him steadily. "Lord Fenwick," she said, "the fourth document outlines the planned improvements for the coming year, with specific timelines and estimated returns. If there are concerns about future performance, they are best addressed by examining the plan, not the past. I would suggest we take the questions in order." The room was quiet. Lord Moorhead, who had not spoken, looked at the first document in front of him. He had been doing mathematics. She had watched him doing it. He turned to the second document. She presented the east boundary analysis last, because she had arranged the morning so that by the time they reached the boundary question, the investors would have spent an hour and a half understanding exactly what the estate's cooperation was worth to them. The figure she had calculated as the cost of the alternative route sat at the bottom of the second document in plain numerals. She did not draw attention to it. She simply read the clause from the founding deed and the 1839 survey and explained the legal position. "The estate is not opposing the development scheme," she said. "The estate is clarifying the terms under which cooperation can proceed. A formal agreement protecting the estate's east field access in perpetuity, in exchange for a fair participation in the scheme's returns, seems to me a reasonable basis for negotiation. I have drafted a proposed clause. It is in the second document at the back." Fenwick looked at William. William said, "I have reviewed Miss Sinclair's analysis. I find it complete. I would welcome the investor's response to the proposed clause." There was a long moment. The portraits on the walls were not helpful. Lord Moorhead set down the second document and looked at Maren directly for the first time that morning. "The Carver matter," he said. "The 400 annually. You found it in the weights discrepancy." "Yes," she said. "And you resolved it by letter, in 1846. March of 1846. He was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who recalibrated quickly, and he was not recalibrating now. He was doing something slower, which was the work of adjusting his understanding of what had happened at Ashford Park for the past 4 years, and what kind of person had been making it happen. He did not say he had been wrong. He said, "That is a well-drafted clause." He set the document flat on the table and said nothing more. William looked at Maren. Then he stood. She had not expected it. He stood, and the room stood with him, 11 men pushing back their chairs in the reflex of the social obligation, and he looked at her with something that was not the measuring attention of the first night, not the careful deliberation of the contract signing, not the quiet of 2 people working by lamplight. It was something clearer than all of that. He walked around the table. He stopped in front of her chair. She looked up at him. He took her right hand, bare. She had removed her gloves to handle the documents, and he held it for a moment, and then he bowed his head and kissed her knuckles, once, plainly, in front of 11 men and 1 solicitor, and the portraits of everyone who had ever made the rules. He was not required to do this. It was not a legal gesture or a social obligation, or a necessary element of the morning's business. He did it because she deserved witnesses. The room did not move for a moment. Then Fenwick, who was a man accustomed to reading rooms because it was how he had survived, looked at Lord Moorhead, and Lord Moorhead looked at the fourth document, and some private calculation was completed that had nothing to do with boundary rights. "The proposed clause seems a reasonable basis for negotiation," Moorhead said, to the room generally. Fenwick said nothing. He gathered his documents with the careful attention of a man who has revised his position and is not going to advertise the revision. The morning concluded in 40 minutes more. In the carriage on the way back to the townhouse William kept in London for the season, Maren looked out the window at the January street and said nothing for a while. Then she said, "The Moorhead comment about the clause." "He meant it," William said. "I know he did," she said. "That's what I was thinking about." William looked at her. She was watching the street with the focused attention she brought to everything, not distracted, simply engaged with what she was seeing. "Miss Sinclair," he said. She turned. "I should like to say something that is not about the estate." She looked at him with the particular stillness she had when receiving information she was not certain how to classify. She waited. "I have been managing an estate in Scotland for 15 years, he said. "I have read a great many accounts and sat across from a great many people who manage things. I have never, in 15 years, encountered someone who does what you do with the precision you bring to it." He paused. He was choosing his words the way he always chose words that mattered. "But that is not the thing I mean to say." "Then say the thing," she said quietly. "In the music room," he said. "In November, you found the right hand by listening." He looked at her directly. "I have been thinking about that for 2 months." She was quiet. The carriage moved through the winter street. "I would like," he said, "to ask you a question that has nothing to do with estate management." "Ask it," she said. He did. The question was not a proposal, not yet. It was, by his precise construction, an inquiry about whether she could consider him, whether she found in him anything she had been looking for without expecting to find. He said this last part simply, without ornament, not because he had always been looking for her, which would have been too convenient to be believed, but because he had been working beside her for 3 months and had stopped being able to imagine working without her, and he wanted her to know that before she answered anything. She thought about it for 11 blocks, by her own later count. Then she said, "Ask me again when we are home." He understood that she meant Ashford Park. He asked her again in the North Library, on the evening of their return, with no one else present and no social architecture to make it a performance. He stood in the room that had been hers in every practical sense for 4 years, and he said what he meant without the formal language, not because it is convenient or appropriate or fitted the requirements my position imposes, but because you know the 1839 survey by heart, and you played the right hand by listening, and you have been managing things that would have broken most people without breaking, and I cannot think of anyone I would rather be in this house with. Maren stood with her hands at her sides and looked at him for a long, unhurried moment. She was 28 years old, and she had been doing real work in invisible rooms for 7 years, and she had known, for most of those 7 years, that what she was waiting for was not rescue. She had long since decided she was not going to step aside for anyone, and she had not, and she had arrived at this room, and this man, with everything she had learned, and everything she had kept. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." She said it simply, and directly, and completely, the way she said everything she meant. He crossed the room and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and they stood there in the North Library among the map cabinet and the lamp and the creditor letters for a considerable while, not moving, not performing, being entirely and specifically themselves. They were married in March of 1849, in the parish church in the village, with Alderton present because he had been there from the beginning, and deserved to see how it ended, and with a woman named Clara Price, who had been Maren's friend since the 2nd week of her formal tenure, direct, clear-eyed, entirely unimpressed by titles but enormously fond of Maren, sitting in the front row with her husband and crying without the slightest attempt to conceal it. The Hardcastle roof was finished before the wedding. The Southfield drainage was completed in April. The wool contract revision was negotiated and signed in May. recovering £238 annually, 18 more than she had estimated. Lord Fenwick attended the wedding, having received his invitation with evident uncertainty, and having accepted it, she suspected, because he was a man who understood the way things resolved and preferred to be on the correct side of history when he could. He did not speak to Maren at any length, but at the wedding breakfast she observed him looking at the East Boundary Clause summary she had prepared, which William had framed and hung in the estate office because he found the gesture appropriate, and she observed Fenwick reading it. He turned away without comment, but he had read it, and that was, she thought, as close to acknowledgment as the occasion required. Lady Cecily Moorhead married in October of that year to a baronet in Hertfordshire. The announcement appeared in the social papers. Maren read it over breakfast with a small, particular smile, not at the event, but at the clean resolution of something that had never needed to be a competition. Lord Moorhead, who had a habit of direct inquiry that she had come to appreciate, stopped her in the corridor at a dinner in the spring and said, with no particular introduction, "That clause held up in the title review." He nodded once and moved on. She understood it for what it was, which was the specific and imperfect recalibration of a man who had been wrong about something and had registered the fact without being able to bring himself to say so in complete sentences. It was enough. It was, perhaps, more than she had expected. Their daughter was born in the autumn of 1849, in the south bedroom at Ashford Park, where the light came in best in the afternoon. They named her James, for Maren's father, which produced some comment in the county, and none at all between the two of them, because William had read the annotated agricultural pamphlets in the second trunk after the wedding, and had understood immediately what the name meant. James Radcliffe learned to walk in the North Library, which her mother had always said produced the best walkers, because there was sufficient interesting furniture to use as handholds. She had her father's coloring and her mother's attention, the ability to focus on a thing with the full weight of her consideration until it resolved, and at 3 years old she understood, with the uncanny accuracy of small children, exactly where things had been put and where they were supposed to be returned. The account books Maren had kept during her 4 years of uncredited management were copied and organized into a final bound version in the summer of 1850, at the request of a neighboring estate solicitor who had heard about the Sheffield merchant recovery and wanted to understand the method. The solicitor shared the method with 2 other estate managers. Those managers shared it in correspondence with 6 others. By 1855, the comparative weights and accounts check was a standard procedure recommended by the York Agricultural Advisory, attributed in a footnote to documented practice at the Ashford Park estate. No name was attached to the footnote, which Maren noted with a quiet, specific satisfaction, because the work was the point, and the work had traveled, and that was more permanent than any attribution. Ashford Park had its first profitable year in a decade in 1850. The 1851 accounts showed a further improvement. The 1852 accounts, which Maren prepared herself and reviewed with Alderton in his York office, were the cleanest he had seen in 40 years of practice. He said so, and then he said nothing more, because he was a man who expressed his respect through precision rather than warmth, and she understood that about him and found it sufficient. On an evening in October of 1852, 4 years since she had arrived at this house with 2 trunks and no illusions, William found her in the North Library at the map cabinet, filing the revised East Boundary Survey that had come back from the title office. He stood in the doorway for a moment, not speaking, not announcing himself. She knew he was there. She had known since the 3rd second. She kept filing. James, who had escaped from her crib somewhere in the upper corridor and navigated, by some combination of determination and luck, to the North Library door, arrived behind her father's legs, seized his trouser leg for balance, and announced herself with a sound that was not quite a word, but carried the full conviction of someone who intended to be part of the conversation. William reached down and collected her without looking away from Maren. He settled their daughter against his shoulder, where she grabbed his cravat immediately and began a serious investigation of its knot. "It is crooked," Maren said from the map cabinet. "It has been crooked since dinner." "It will be crooker still in a moment," he said, which was not a word, but James seemed to find it satisfying. Maren filed the last survey, closed the drawer, and turned around. He was standing in the doorway of the North Library with their daughter on his shoulder and the lamplight behind him, and he was watching her the way he had been watching her, she thought, from approximately the moment she had told him his cravat was crooked in the study 3 years ago. She walked toward him. She straightened the cravat, one-handed, with the ease of long practice. James examined her work and appeared to approve it. The three of them stood there, in the doorway of the North Library of Ashford Park, with the October evening cooling outside, and the lamps burning and the map cabinet in order, and the accounts straight, and Maren Sinclair, who was now Maren Radcliffe, and had been managing things since before anyone had thought to give her a title for it, looked at what she had built with her own 2 hands, and found it, finally and exactly, sufficient.